Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to invite you to my talk about multi-gigabit Ethernet for enthusiasts and small businesses. The contact data is in the left corner. Please write any feedback, questions, what you might have. So I'll talk about why we should actually want to have 10 gigabit Ethernet at home or in a small office. I will talk about some technical stuff, but just briefly. Then I'll discuss what to use with 10 gigabit Ethernet. Maybe you want to use old copper cables from other times. Or maybe you will deploy fiber, which is not that costly anymore. I'll discuss some pricing and observations about switches, network cards. I'll also give some tips that you will probably not read in the manual or will not see on the first page of the specifications. And I'll also talk about support in Linux and very briefly also BSDs. And I'll give some tips and tricks in general. So, why should we buy something that does more than 1 gigabit Ethernet for home or office use? I'm targeting 10 gigabit Ethernet. But I'll talk about the other two also. There are possibilities about 2.5 and 5 gigabit Ethernets nowadays, which is pretty new, the standard, and so there are some rough edges. Okay, nowadays we have high-speed SSDs. They are way faster than 10 gigabit can deliver in most cases. We have RAID arrays. They can saturate 10 gigabit easily too. So the use cases are some after a photo shoot, the photographer comes back home or to the office and wants to do a quick backup so he can go to the other photo shoot maybe. And this shouldn't take too long. So he would use 10 gigabit Ethernet maybe. Most photographers use Macs, and Macs have Thunderbolt interface. And for this interface, you can buy 10 gigabit network cards today. So this is a possibility. In some cases, like in environments where you have multiple people, like 20 people in an office, you will have 1 or 2 access points. Many people will use the Wi-Fi network together and will share bandwidth. And so what you want to do is the access point should have a connection that is faster than 1 gigabit per second. And we already have Wi-Fi standards that are faster than 1 gigabit also in practice. Those are 802.11 AC if used with multiple antennas, and 802.11 AX. This is the new Wi-Fi standard 6, as was mentioned last week. And this can actually deliver over 1 gigabit of traffic in one spatial stream. So, and there are actually access points that you can buy today that have 5 gigabit per second connections. Some people have bonding and load balancing problems if they use, for instance, 2 or 4 1 gigabit connections because of the hashing algorithm that splits the load between those connections. So in those cases, it might be interesting to just use 1 or 2 connections that are a bit better spec'd. Also, nowadays in some countries you get gigabit internet uplinks for home users, and so the idea is that the local network should always be a bit faster than the WAN interface, and so this might be also a motivation for enthusiasts that are always on the bleeding edge of technology and want to show off a bit. So how does it work? We have, since the 2000s, we have 1 gigabit Ethernet, so it's almost 20 years old nowadays. Then 3 to 7 years later, depending on what standard, we got 10 gigabit Ethernet, which has a different line encoding if used on copper to be more efficient. And some years ago, there was a new standard, the 802.3bz, also sometimes referred to as N-base-T, that is meant for twisted pair and 2.5 and 5 gigabit speeds. It uses the same line encoding as 10 gigabit Ethernet, so it's a close relative, but it uses less spectrum on the cable. So you are able to use worse cables for these interconnects and still use the whole 100 meters of cable. So this is very good because most deployments are still on category 5E cables, and in those cases you get 2.5 times speed increase without changing the cables, which is always a factor. How does it look like for the uninitiated? On the left, you see SFP Plus connectors as seen in an Aruba module. On the right, you see so-called smart rate ports. Those are just regular RJ45 connectors, but those in this module, they go to 10 gigabit each. And they also support 2.5 and 5 gigabit in this version. On the top, there is a GBIC transmitter and receiver in one piece. And you take these if you want to convert an electrical signal to optical signal and back again. And you stick those in these cages on the left and put an optical cable inside, and then you have an optical interconnect. You can also buy cables that have something like transceivers on each end. Those are actually coaxial cables inside, and they are for short ranges, so maybe like 5 meters. Then you don't have to buy optical transceivers converted to optics and back again. You just put it in a different encoding and then decode it back, but it's still electrical signal. Those cables that are copper but have those transceiver ends, those are called direct attached copper or direct attached cable. Yes. And mostly if you buy from original equipment manufacturers, those are way cheaper than buying 2 optics and a patch cable. But if you buy a third party, it might be similar. So, in any network nowadays, you have a star topology. That means, or sometimes rings, but star is better, believe me. You need switches. So first we focus on what a switch should do when we want to have a 10 gigabit connection. It should obviously have the connectors. it should handle VLANs, virtual LANs, so you can separate traffic efficiently. For instance, you don't want printers in your storage area network. You want some features for security like DHCP snooping that basically prevents that you get to DHCP or an DHCP server that you didn't allow, that some clients could connect to it instead of the rightful DHCP server. So to prevent that, you have features like DHCP snooping. It would be nice if the switch could do some routing, so better switches can do some features that are higher up the stack. So routing would be a nice thing. It should do ACLs. This is something like a very basic firewall rules. So you can already on the switch separate some traffic out, and you don't have to do it on the router that can do more intricate stuff. It would be nice if it had an SSH connection for management or the capability to enable SSH. And it would be best if it could do some kind of stacking for redundancy and ease of management. Yeah, let's see about that, what we can get, right? You should also think about if you need power over Ethernet, so that would also quite increase your budget needs. For instance, you need power over Ethernet if you have voice over IP, which obviously doesn't need 10 gigabit Ethernet, but you should consider it. And you should consider it if you have Wi-Fi access points. Those sometimes can be connected over regular socket, but mostly it is more convenient to just connect it, put power and data through one cable. I've talked about direct attached cables. So you would want to use those in a data center, or maybe optics if the data center is large, or if you have 2 server rooms in an office building that you want to connect, something like that, because yeah, those are lower power, but you have to consider that you need those SFP cages on the switch to stick those connectors in. For workstations, you need the typical RJ45 connectors mostly, but you can install additional cards also, and those are available with SFP Plus also. So it depends. For mobile clients, like laptops, sometimes you have no Ethernet connector anymore. So there you would look for Thunderbolt maybe in the first place and some adapters. This is a decent solution. It might be costly, but it works. Or in the near future, Aquantia, the hardware developer, promised USB 3 adapters for 5 gigabit Ethernet. So this could be a solution to some of the problems and should be inexpensive, so about less than $100 probably. Okay, so I searched a bit and I have found some switches that I propose for our solution on the budget. So the goal is to keep the whole network under 1,000 euros and connect 2 workstations or servers over 10 gigabit Ethernet to a switch that connects to the rest of the network. So we need at least 3 connectors. We need 2 10 gigabit Ethernet connectors and 1 for the rest of the network, at least. So I propose a FiberStore switch, which is the cheapest option on this list, but does a lot. Fiberstore is not known a lot, but it's a hardware manufacturer that comes from China and provides third-party transceivers. This is the main line of business of them. And they are shipping to Cloudflare and other big companies, and they are able to keep the prices down. So the most inexpensive transceivers start maybe at $6 or $7, and the 10 gigabit transceivers, they start at $16. So this is cheap, and it works. In some cases we deploy 30, 40 of those 10 gigabit transceivers, and we haven't had any failure until this point. Okay, so what does this switch do? It has 24 gigabit ports for SFP plus ports. It costs less than 300 euros after all taxes, shipping and stuff. It is stackable, so you can use cables to connect more of those switches over those SFP plus connectors together and manage them as one. This is very handy for redundancy and ease of management because it's not really solvable otherwise. It can do dynamic routing, so it can do OSPF, which is pretty much unseen in this category. It has full SSH management, so there is pretty much no web interface. It's all on you, but that's a good thing if you understand your stuff. A more known brand of hardware is Ubiquiti. They have an interesting switch. This switch has 12 SFP plus connectors, so and for 10 gigabit Ethernet over regular copper. This is some serious switching stuff in an inexpensive box, but unfortunately it doesn't have many features that you would like. It has VLANs, it has some static routing, but you should evaluate if you need those additional features, and if it doesn't match it, then you shouldn't buy it. An unknown tip: HP has this Office Connect line of switches, and the 1950 line of those includes power over Ethernet capable switches. It has a serious aggregation switch that has also something like 16 10 gigabit ports, and it also includes this 24 gigabit Ethernet plus to SFP plus to 10 gigabit copper connectors. And this is the most inexpensive one of those. It costs 610 euros, so it's a bit pricier, but and usually comes without full CLI management. But the full CLI management can be turned on if you know a special login. And then you discover it is a full Conver 7 switch, and those normally with better chips, but the CLI is the same. Those usually start at 3,000 or 4,000 euros. So I think this is a good tip. And by the way, you have a lifetime warranty on those switches, so it might be interesting. They say it's a developer mode and you shouldn't tell them, but they'll probably not know. Yeah, some people like Netgear because some people think it's cheap, but it isn't. It's actually more costly than all of those other options and isn't any better. But I wanted to show there is something and you can buy it, but it doesn't have any CLI from what I know, which is not really good because you cannot get support from the outside easily. It has telnet, so you can manage it over unencrypted connections, but this is also not actually meant for the usual user. It's actually meant for if they need to debug something, then yeah. Some people also like to buy MikroTik switches and routers. Those that I have listed are also both under 400 euros and are quite capable. The one on the left has 16 10 gigabit ports, so it's a lot. And the one on the right has more 1 gigabit ports, but also some 10 gigabit ports. They should be quite capable, but we read every another week about some security flaws in MikroTik routers and switches, and that they are misused by all the governments and spying agencies around the world, or some other software or malware. So I don't know how about buying those. Mostly from what I have heard, those are cheap and good for a start if you are an ISP or some startup, but later on you will probably replace them, so you might just as well just do the right thing already and buy something which is a bit better. For the hosts, you need some network cards. The most popular ones are Intel based. This is in the first bullet point, there is the switch, the NIC number, the NIC chip number. It is available in 1 and 2 port configurations, and usually comes for about 150 euros if you don't buy directly from Intel. So Intel sells its chips to some third party. They implement a network card, and this is about half as much money as the Intel original card. So figure out. It works. You probably don't need the original one. Aquantia, a newcomer to the network interface space. They are more or less known from wireless, but nowadays they also are pioneers in the 2.5 and 5 gigabit Ethernet versions. And they also have a chip that can do 10 gigabit. And this is the AQC 107. And you can buy network cards that have 1 port, either SFP Plus or RJ45. And I have read news last week that Realtek has some cheaper NICs for usual workstations or something that will do just 2.5 gigabit Ethernet or lower, obviously. But those should be dirt cheap, and those, if it comes on the market, then it should be pretty much in every laptop, in every computer. So this is something to observe. Also, Aquantia should have an integrated solution where on one side they have USB 3 for connection to some laptop or host, and on the other way they will have 5 gigabit Ethernet. So this should be also interesting. This is what I have described at the start of the talk. You should also consider those transceivers, as I have said, some for shorter distances and less good cables. Those are 20 euros a piece, approximately. Better ones that can transfer the signal over 10 kilometers. Those cost about 50 euros, so not very expensive, but you always need 2 of those, and you need a cable in between. So on Linux and the BSDs nowadays, with usual processors, it is possible to do filtering, routing, all these nice things in line rate 10 gigabit. It's not easy, but it's possible. And you shouldn't need to configure too much of the stuff. You will probably need a better processor then, because you don't know what you are doing exactly, but there is the power to manage. The drivers are there. Most of those kernels are well prepared, well equipped to deal with 10 gigabit Ethernet. Some of those Intel cards, they are in the kernel for many years already, so even older distributions should be perfectly fine. And the Aquantia driver is in the kernel from 4.11, which is something like 2016, I think. So you should be fine. It just works most of the time. So the conclusion. So we are able to actually buy a 10 gigabit network for under 1,000 euros. We can have a switch to network interface cards and all the transceivers, patch cables we need for under 1,000 euros. And there are still some rough edges. You really need to decide, do you need all these steps between 1 and 10 gigabit Ethernet, 2.5 gigabit, 5 gigabit, because some support only 1 and 10 gigabit, but not those in between. You, of course, need the cabling, so you should consider that. You don't have so many switches to choose from. So some switches just have SFP+, because that is here since 2003 or so. And some include RJ45 capable of 10 gigabit speeds, but maybe don't support power over Ethernet. So if you want to connect access points to it and want to power those, then you might be out of luck. Also, the problem is that the equipment is still quite expensive for most people. You will not just go to Tesco and buy a nice 10 gigabit switch. And the problem is also that most users don't have the motivation to go to higher speeds than gigabit, because gigabit is fine, and most devices use the internet or other network services over wireless, and in most cases this is actually less performant than 1 gigabit still. So this is a problem, because if people don't want to buy it, then it will never come down with price sufficiently that it's actually interesting for the usual customer. But for enthusiasts and small offices, it is well doable. Thank you. I have left plenty of time for discussion, questions, feedback, whatever you like. We have 20 minutes time, and I might answer all your questions now. Yes? Can you use the microphone, please? Or you have to unmute it. So. Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. I would like to ask about the devices you are talking about. You mentioned the cheapest one, and do you have personal experience with them, or just SFP modules, as you said?
You are talking about the MikroTik
The fiber
stuff?
stores. The fiber store.
Fiber store.
Yeah.
I have a switch. I have 4 or 5 switches from Fiber Store that are even cheaper than this one, but they don't do 10 gigabit Ethernet. I haven't had any problems with them The CLI is similar somewhat to Cisco, so you will find yourself at home probably. For instance, the IP configuration is for IPv4 and IPv6 is split, but I don't know about many other switches that can do static routing for under 200 euros. So this is okay. And the transceivers, those are perfect. I mean, for the price, it works. I have never had any problems. They have pretty much all the gear that you need, but there are also other parties that can sell you cheap transceivers. But FiberStore, in my experience, is the cheapest.
Okay, and have you tried it in stack? As you said, it's stackable. So did you personally try that?
Those switches that I have are not stackable, but those that I propose, they should be, and I think that should work fine.
Okay. And
so I read reports that it works. So.
And do you know if that 10 gigs switches, do they support multi-chassis link aggregation or not?
Those switches on this list don't. But for instance, the HPE Office Connect, there you have interesting other options in the series that you can stack together. So you can have like an aggregation switch that is this crazy switch that is basically 2 times as good as all the others in the series, and connect it with maybe one of those. I have to say, if you read the specs very carefully, then in the Office Connect line, I think you can connect only 2 of those aggregation switches. So instead of 4, you just can do 2. But yeah, that should be sufficient for most people because of redundancy. So, and the good thing about the IRF that is used for the stacking and is also used on the higher end of data center switches from HPE. You can use IRF over 10 kilometers distance. So you can have a split core switch or something, and it should work. And it does. I use IRF on the switches 5930, I think, Converse switches, expensive pieces of data center equipment, but the technology is the same, and obviously they use the same software underneath, so it should work.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Some other questions?
Thank you. Adam, do you have any experience with some of this equipment under heavy load, I don't know, 50, 70% of 10 gigabits or more coding for these switches? I don't know.
I don't, but I heard from people that the HP Office Connect line is quite okay. I think those FiberStore switches should be fine also. So I haven't heard any complaints. But I mean, for switching, they should be fine, right? It's those features that are problematic. For instance, those Office Connect switches, this line only supports 32 static routes. So you will have to think about it if it's enough. Those aggregation chassis from the same line, they support 512 static routes. So that should be okay, but you have to keep that in mind that there are limitations. Also, if you need more than 8 VLANs, then you should probably look elsewhere. The FiberStore, interestingly enough, doesn't have many of those limitations. They will happily say, oh, you can use everything you like, but probably you would need to, from time to time, look at the performance. For instance, if you cross a boundary, something like 64 static routes or 128 or something, you should probably do a measurement that it still works as intended. because it's very well possible that they do the routing on the CPU of the switch, and that it will not be powerful enough to do all the routing. So yeah, you have to test it. But anyways, you can always buy or use an old PC for the routing, which with Linux or some BSD should be sufficient for even 10 gigabits.
Yeah, that's probably true. And maybe one thing about the MikroTik, I think these CRS aren't those switches, technically?
Switches, yes.
Yeah, because MikroTik also has like a cloud route line of products which is better suited for routing, has more powerful processors. Just like adding to the good lineup.
Oh, thanks. There is a question in the middle.
Do you think for home use for new network is better to use RJ45 or SFP plus cables, like optic cables?
Interesting question. Actually, I don't have a good answer, I think. I deployed a network recently that at home that pretty surely will support 10 gigabit Ethernet over copper. But the problem is that you don't have many switches to choose from. So I don't want to have a Netgear. I mean, I want to have SSH and stuff, and you don't find well-priced switches for 10 gigabit over copper nowadays easily. So it's like those Netgears and MikroTiks, and it should work, but I would like to have at least 12 connections because I have 12 sockets, so I want to keep them all busy. And yeah, so this I haven't found a switch that will have that for under 1,000 euros, and I would be fine with that. So. Sometimes in the networking area it is interesting because sometimes you have discounts of 70% on equipment if you buy a lot. For instance, if you are a huge company, then the equipment manufacturer or the seller will offer you large discounts and better options and stuff. So, for instance, if you sometimes you can manage that you at your company buy a lot of stuff and then say, okay, so because we have bought so much, then maybe you can include this and this, and I will manage with the company financially, and so you get equipment that would normally cost something like 2,000 or 3,000 euros for just about 1,000 euros. For instance, I don't know if people are interested in this kind of stuff, because I mean it's a whole month's salary probably for most people that would go on the switch. So I don't know, but that falls under the enthusiast thing. Some people buy cars and some people buy switches, right? Does it answer your question? Actually, you can, from Fiber Store, you can buy fiber cables. So you could tell them what lengths do you need. They would send you the cable with connectors and everything. So you can put it in the wall or under the carpet or something, and that should work. I mean, I have done something like that. We ordered a 15-meter cable, and then they can even ship it with something like a pull strap. That basically there is something to hold it on the cable while you are pulling, and to so you don't break those connectors of the cable also. And it works. It's not very cheap, but I mean, you do those things once and then you are done. So also some people, if you talk to Silicon Hill, maybe you will get, you can borrow a splice box and do a proper cabling at home. I don't know.
Well, the problem is that when I will want to like use some RJ45 cables, for example with USB 3.0 adapters, then it's really hard to find SFP Plus to RJ45 adapters under like $200.
Yes, that's true. Actually, MikroTik sells some transceivers that basically just translate the electrical signal to 10 gigabit copper cable, basically. Those cost, I think, something like $70. It's not cheap, but if it's just this one connection that you need, then maybe it will be sufficient. FiberStore has 10 gigabit copper transceivers for 150 euros or something, which is expensive. Yeah.
If you talk about those transceivers from MikroTik, they actually can do like 200 meters at a 2.5 gig. If you look to the data sheet, they have a specification that they have some special chip from, I don't know the manufacturer right now, but they can do like 5 gig over like 150 meters, 10 gig over 100 meters, and 2.5 gig over 200 meters. So if you like need like lengthy cable somewhere like in here, and you just can't afford the optic, then you can go with this, and it will sufficiently cover your needs.
Yes. Thank you. That's interesting. I mean, by the way, for instance, as a side note, I have Turis Omnia at home, and FiberStore transceivers work in Turis Omnia. So if somebody needs that, I think this is interesting information. I mean, of course, that's just 1 gigabit, but it's good to know that you can place your Turis Omnia 10 kilometers away from your home or something. Any other questions, observations?
I would like just ask, because I've had like Cisco was working and had a multi-gigabit switches like 4 years ago, and they working in NBASE-T Alliance. Like if you check some solution on a Cisco as well, is it possible to make it like in the small business?
I don't think Cisco sells something for small businesses that is interesting, because Cisco has the problem is that Cisco in most cases has the licensing policy for advanced features that is not very friendly towards customers.
Are you sure it's licensing?
Yes, because I mean you will not get, for instance, security patches if you don't buy the license. So you need the contract. So security updates for those switches, and you really want those because Cisco is not known to be like super focused on security. I mean, like they have something like they had passwords in clear text in the firmware. So it's a matter of strings and the firmware binary, and there is your password.
Have you tried to encrypt the password?
No, those were in clear text. So I mean, some developer forgot it there, and you can crack most passwords nowadays anyway. So.
Have you checked like there is like SG 300 series?
I didn't, but I will look into it, and we keep in touch. I mean, we can.
I actually cannot agree like with the security problems. But okay, we have different maybe.
Yeah, so the point is that some companies don't care so much about security because they think they are behind a firewall, and they have some production network that cannot go offline, so they cannot update because most switches cannot be updated in service while they are working. They need to be rebooted, and so most companies just don't do it because it's too much trouble. My company also didn't do that, but this will be changing.
Okay, thank you.
I hope I
maybe
could answer your...
Check the Cisco sites and maybe we will see the...
SG300.
SG300 I found on the internet. There are some small business, multi-gigabit and 10 gigs.
Yes.
Here. So.
And how much do they cost?
I had no time to check the prices. Actually, I ask you if you check that.
Yeah, I think they will be over 1,000 euros.
I think maybe it depends, like on the project, maybe. So.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Cisco, HPE, Juniper, all those companies. If you buy hundreds of the switches, then they will provide you anything basically for you pretty much can dictate the price. You'll just say, oh, we'll go to this other company, and they say, oh, maybe then we'll save 10% also. And
actually, I cannot like I have some experience with some Cisco switches, so I cannot agree with the problem with the security, because if you don't have a switch in default, you don't have a problem even like in clear text anything. Mm-hmm. So I don't. It's not in
the problem. No. What you mean? Sorry, is that the password you configured for access. But I was talking about a developer access. That was the firmware needs to be developed somewhere, and there was a different password in the firmware. So the developer can access the device always, but they forgot it. They didn't remove it. So this is totally independent from the default password that you might have or some other passwords that you can configure. Sure, you can configure passwords on Cisco devices that are not encrypted and just are in the configuration. But you can also specify some hashing function that is used and stuff like that. I don't know if it's really secure. I mean, you shouldn't. You should keep your management on a separate VLAN and do all these precautions to prevent accidents like that. Anyway, so sure. Pick your poison.
Thank you. Maybe take this discussion offline, so the discussion will be so long. Thank you.
We have one last question or one last comment, and then we'll need to stop. Are there any further questions?
Maybe just a clarification to what the gentleman in front of me said. We actually use this, one of the dormitories, I think it is Havkovakola, uses the Cisco Small Business Series switches. And I don't know if they have the model with 10 gigabit uplinks, but I believe they, like the price in sufficient quantity, I think the price would be more or less equivalent with, for example, the Hewlett-Packard price of the Office Connect. I think he said that it wasn't that expensive as the Catalyst switches. Yeah.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you for coming to my talk and listening all the time.